Hello there and welcome to The World Today on Channels Television. I'm Cynthia Arrow. We begin in Hong Kong, where leaders of pro-democracy protest groups in the country have threatened to call off talks with the government after demonstrators were involved in scuffles with angry opponents. They stand by the fact that the government must desist from organized attacks on supporters and are still very angry at plans to vet poor candidates.
A handful of anti-Occupy protesters staged a small counter-demonstration at Hong Kong's Mong Kok protest site on Friday, chanting slogans and pushing pro-democracy protesters in what appeared to be an attempt to provoke a confrontation between the two sides. As the conflict escalated, chants went up of peace, peace from the Occupy protesters, who also waved signs appealing for calm.
I think they are going to provoke us. So we just stay to calm down my campus.
Any sign of violence would make police intervention to clear the protests much more likely, something that the authorities have shied away from so far after riot police tear gas gassing crowds at the weekend led to many more joining the protests. Protesters are now concerned that the authorities are playing a waiting game, betting on the numbers dwindling further as the time goes on, reducing the protest's legitimacy and the pressure for the authorities to forge a compromise.
I stress that the police will exercise the greatest tolerance, but I ask the protester to cooperate with the police.
Earlier on Friday morning, protesters blockaded the central government office and Chief Executive's office in central Hong Kong. Tens of thousands have taken to Hong Kong's streets in the past week to demand full democracy in the former British colony, including a free voting system when they come to choose a new leader in 2017. Che was asked by reporters about armed police near protest sites.
I emphasize that these are the standard anti-riot equipment of the police tactical unit of the police.
Scuffles broke out in one of Hong Kong's most famous and congested shopping districts on Friday as hundreds of supporters of Chinese rule stormed tents and ripped down banners belonging to pro-democracy protesters, forcing many to retreat. Hong Kong leader Liu Qingying agreed to open talks with pro-democracy protesters but refused to stand down. He and his Chinese government backers made clear that they would not back down in the face of the city's worst unrest in decades.
Now, the Voice of America's Brian Padden is in Hong Kong, and he sent us this package.
3, 2, 1. So I'm standing in the neighborhood of Mong Kok, where there is a confrontation happening between pro-student, pro-democracy demonstrators and people who are calling themselves workers and businessmen who say they are sick and tired of the disruption to their lives. They are trying to surround the pro-democracy students. They want to dismantle the barricades, and they want this whole protest time to stop. And they are angry, and they are pushing and shoving. Police are actually standing between the two protesters, the anti-student protesters and the pro-democracy demonstrators. The government last night announced they would start a dialogue with the students, and that initially eased tensions today in most of the city. But this afternoon in Hong Kong, a new group of angry protesters have emerged. They are against the student pro-democracy movement, and they want Hong Kong to go back to the way it was. For Channels TV, Brian Padden, VOA News.
Many thanks to our colleague at the VOA there, Brian Padden. Now, the United States has even more support as regards its military action against the Islamic State militants. A few minutes ago, we just learned that Canada has also announced that it will also participate in the airstrikes against the ISIS militants, but it will also desist from ground attack. In the meantime, the Australian cabinet has given its approval for fighter jets to join in the action against ISIS as well. The Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott tags ISIS a death cult that has declared war on the world and must be stopped. The extremist group controls a broad swathe of territory spanning a borderless stretch of Syria and Iraq.
Special Forces troops will be deployed in Iraq to assist in the fight against Islamic State militants ISIS. Prime Minister Tony Abbott and its aircraft will also join the US-led coalition strike. Abbott said Australian troops will be engaged in advice and assist capacity to support the Iraqi army in their battle against the militant Islamist group. He was accompanied by the Chief of Australian Defence Forces, Mark Binskin, and Minister for Defence, David Johnson, as he made the announcement in a nationally televised news conference. The United States has been bombing Islamic State and other groups in Syria for almost 2 weeks with the help of Arab allies and hitting targets in neighboring Iraq since August. European countries have joined the campaign in Iraq, but not in Syria. Last month, Abbott sent aircraft and 600 personnel to the United Arab Emirates in preparation for joining the coalition. He has since said it was likely Australian aircraft would join the strikes to combat Islamic State, which he described as a murderous death cult. While the involvement of Australian aircraft had been flagged, the use of Australian troops on the ground in Iraq was not as widely anticipated.
Today, Cabinet has authorised Australian airstrikes in Iraq at the request of the Iraqi government and in support of the Iraqi government. Also, subject to final legal documentation, Cabinet has authorised the deployment of Australian Special Forces into Iraq to advise and assist Iraqi forces.
So far, Australian aircraft have been limited to humanitarian and delivering arms to Iraqi government-backed forces. Australia is on the high alert for attacks by radicalized Muslims or by homegrown militants returning from fighting in the Middle East, having raised its threat level to high and undertaken a series of high-profile raids in major cities. Officials believe up to 160 Australians have been either involved in fighting in the Middle East or actively supporting groups fighting there. At least 20 are believed to have returned to Australia and have been said to pose a security risk. Prominent Australian Muslims say their community is being unfairly targeted by law enforcement and threatened by right-wing groups, and there are concerns that policies aimed at combating radical Islamists could create a backlash. Abbott said Islamic State poses a grave threat to both Australia and the wider world, and that Canberra could not afford to shrink its responsibility to contribute militarily to degrading the group's capabilities.
The Americans certainly have quite a substantial special forces component on the ground already. My understanding is that there are UK and Canadian special forces already inside Iraq. So we'll be operating on a much smaller scale, but in an entirely comparable way to the United States Special Forces.
The Australian contingent in the UAE is made up of 8 Super Hornet fighter jets, an early warning and control aircraft, an aerial refueling aircraft, along with 400 Air Force personnel and 200 Special Force soldiers.
On the ISIS militants, I'm now being joined live from Washington, D.C. by the Voice of America's Elizabeth Arrott. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us again on The World Today. We're glad to have you.
Good to be here, Cynthia.
Now, I'd like to start by asking you, a lot of countries are joining in on the air offensive, like Canada and Australia. But I just want to say, are these really effective, especially when we see that the Islamic State militants are engaging in combat with Kurdish troops or Kurdish forces on ground? Isn't a ground offensive more realistic in yielding better results?
Well, the coalition's argument is that it is doing all of these airstrikes to help ground troops, in particular the Iraqi army, make some headway, and the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces, make some headway against Islamic State militants. Now, obviously, that's not, there aren't the forces necessarily in Syria to do that, so that's a very good point. There is, in many circles, thinking that this coalition is, their current strategy is the first step. There are advisors that they're helping people on the ground, but unless there's a substantial ground troop to go against them, that's really not going to be that much help. And we've seen this in Kobani, Ain al-Arab, along the Turkish border of the Syrian town, largely Kurdish, which right now we're getting reports of actual street by street, house by house fighting between the Kurdish fighters and the Islamic State militants. And even though there have been bombings there, it hasn't slowed their progress at all.
Now, Elizabeth, you just mentioned that the airstrikes are a first step, but do you have any idea on the other strategies that might be in place as regards this U.S.-led coalition?
Again, very, very tricky, because most people are saying they don't want to put soldiers in combat positions. Already we're seeing a little bit more. We have American advisors on the ground. There were some comments by an American general recently that they might have to go out on combat missions. Most governments that have contributed to this coalition are very leery of that, of getting, and as is President Obama, and of getting involved in a ground war in Syria or Iraq. But most military analysts will point out, very much as you did, that it's very, very hard to move against them effectively, against Islamic State, without putting troops on the ground.
Now, finally, before I let you go, Elizabeth, we've seen appeals from the father of hostages like John Cantley. Any idea of what's being done to free such people?
Well, it's difficult because they have, the United States and Britain and other countries have made it clear that they will not do any kind of ransom. Other countries do, but even France, which is believed by many people to have paid ransom, when we saw, for example, in Algeria, when a French national was held hostage, they did not move to meet their demands, and he was tragically killed. So it's very difficult to make these kind of trades. Turkey was successful in getting its diplomats released, but for a lot of other Western nations, it's a very, very difficult situation.
We do understand it's a very difficult situation, but we appreciate your time, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. I've been speaking with the Voice of America's Elizabeth Arrott from Washington, D.C. She's been telling us more about the Islamic State militants. We'll take a break now on The World Today. When we come back, a cameraman working in Liberia tests positive for the Ebola virus disease. Please stay with us.